Hello, and welcome to the Credentials and Account Access session of the Google Ads API Migration Workshops. I am Abraham Williams. I am a Developer Relations Engineer for the Google Ads API team. I'm super excited to have you here, so let's get started. Some of the things we're going to talk about today is OAuth, what that means, how that helps you get credentials and act as a user to interact with the Google Ads API. We'll talk about how to use and configure client libraries. We provide a number of them to help you get up and running quickly and easily. They're a great resource. We will also talk about the Google Ads Doctor, which is a tool we provide to help you debug configuration and authentication issues. And will also help you resolve those quickly. We'll then see a couple of example issues that people run into a lot of times when they're interacting with OAuth before we see a successful request at the end. The code lab is linked below this video. I encourage that you download it and follow along. It will have code that you can easily copy and paste from it, as well as you're welcome to follow along the code lab at a later date. If you run into an issue, we do encourage that you post to the Q&A forum. You'll find that below this video as well. We will try to have an answer for you as quickly as possible, so feel free to post any questions that you might have there. Some of the bits of information that you will need is you will need a Google Ads test account, specifically a client account that you can use to test running ads with. Once you have one of these, you will get a Google Ads account ID. This is found in the Ads UI. Anytime you're asked to use this in the API, it'll generally be without the dashes in it. Additionally, you will need a developer token. This developer token will need to be from a non-test Google Ads manager account. Once you have one of those, the tools and settings page will give you this developer token. This will be passed to the Google Ads API anytime you make a request. Once you have a Google Ads account to make requests with, a developer token to associate with those requests, you will also need to enable the API, and that will be done using a Google Cloud Platform project. In it, you will find a list of a large number of APIs that Google provides. Specifically, you will need to enable the Google Ads API. Once you have the Google Ads API enabled, you can start interacting with the actual API. There is a kind of a key piece of information that you'll need to know here is that once you make a API request to the Google Ads API with a developer token associated with it, that is the only developer token that you can use with this specific Google Cloud project. If you have a developer token, if you have a test developer token and a production developer token, you can't switch back and forth between them for a single cloud project. You'll need to create a cloud project for each developer token. Once you have that cloud project set up, you'll need to create some OAuth 2 credentials, specifically of type desktop. This will give you a client ID and a client secret that will be a part of the configuration used for the client library. With all those bits of information, you will need to choose a client library to install in your environment. For this specific session, I will be demonstrating using Ruby. You're welcome to choose any other language that you feel more comfortable with. Just note that there will be some differences between how they're configured and the code that is executed. There are links throughout the code lab that show you the configuration formats and example code for the other client library languages. These are the different languages that we officially support. If you don't want to use one of these languages, we do also have a REST API that uses JSON, but you do have to handle a lot more of the underlying infrastructure in those scenarios. If you choose one of the client libraries that we provide out of the box, it will use gRPC and protobufs, which is a nice, efficient over-the-wire format, as well as providing a really nice hook into whichever language you're using. And then finally, you will also need Git installed. We will use this to download the Google Ads Doctor tool. So, OAuth, what is it? Well, I'm glad you asked. OAuth is what powers sign in with Google. So anytime you sign into a website or an application using your Google account, in the background it is using one of several open standards that are fit into the OAuth bucket. Essentially, OAuth makes it so that a user can grant access to their Google account data through a third-party website or application. And it makes it safe to do so without you having to share your Google password with anybody. OAuth supports a number of different flows. The two main flows that you would want to use with the Google Ads API is the web flow and the desktop flow. The web flow is great if you want to have a website that a large number of users sign into and authorize their accounts to be accessed by your app. One downside is it's a little bit more complicated to set up, and it does require a web server. The desktop flow, which is the flow that we recommend you use with the Google Ads API, is a little simpler to get set up, to set up and get running. We do also provide example scripts and all the client libraries that make it essentially a run of a command to go through this flow. This is easier and recommended if you are using a smaller number of Google accounts on a single machine. And so, for example, if you have a single Google account that is associated with a Google Ads Manager account and manages a number of sub-client accounts, then this is a great approach to managing that authentication simply. So the way the OAuth desktop flow works is you will have a device that you're running your environment on. In it, you'll have a client app. In this work session, we actually have two client apps, two pieces of software that are configured to be the client app. One will be a script that we will write as we progress through the session, and the other one is the OAuth, the Google Ads Doctor tool. Those will both act as client apps. So you'll have to configure the client app with, for example, your client ID and client secret. Using that info, you will generate a authorization URL that will be opened in the browser, and it will render a Google authorization endpoint page. This page will make sure that you're signed into a Google account and you're signed into a specific Google account. So if you're signed into 5, you'll have to pick the specific one you want to grant authorization as. Additionally, it will list the different scopes, OAuth scopes, that the client app is requesting access to. A scope will be, Google Ads API would be one scope. Gmail, reading Gmail is another scope. Getting the user's email address is another scope. So scope is essentially a bucket of data of what you want the client app to be able to access. Once authorization is granted, Google will create an authorization code that will be displayed in the browser, and you'll have to manually copy and paste that to the client app. This is the main differentiator between the desktop flow and the web flow. The web flow, you don't have to manually copy and paste anything because Google will redirect to a web server and have that handoff happen automatically. Once the client app has that authentication code, that authorization code, it will get sent to a Google token endpoint, which will then return an access token and a refresh token, which are credentials that you will save and use to access the Google Ads API or other Google APIs if you're granting multiple scopes. So that is the OAuth flow. Let's get into some coding. So with Ruby, to install the dependency, the gem, as it's called, we will create a gem file. within that gem file, we'll specify that, hey, we're going to use the Google Ads gem and a specific version of it. Once we have that dependency file set up, and note that the gem file is specific to the Ruby language. If you're using a different language, for example Python, then you would be using requirements.txt. Once that's installed, once you have that file, that dependency file set up, you can install those dependencies using bundle install. Most of these dependencies have previously been installed, so they're pretty quick to install for me. With the dependencies installed, we need to actually interact with the API somehow. For these demos, we're going to use a script file that we can just execute directly. A lot of times you're probably not going to have a script file, although you might, if you're doing daily batch jobs of some sort, maybe you would have a cron job that would execute a script regularly. But a lot of times you'll just kind of have the API interactions happen from within your code. So inside of this this main file, the script that we're going to run, we're just going to keep it simple for right now. We're going to load the dependency, the Google Ads gem dependency, and then we'll instantiate a new instance of a Google Ads API client. This client is the entry point for any time that you want to interact with the Google Ads API. So with those basic couple of lines in the script, if we execute it using bundle exec, this is essentially how we can execute this script in Ruby and make sure that we specify it uses the dependency versions that we asked for in the gem file. So when we run this, we'll see that there's an error, no configuration file at location, which is totally what we expect because we haven't created that file yet. In Ruby, the configuration file is going to be a .rb file. This is one of those areas that will be different depending upon the client library language that you choose. For example, Python, you might be using a .yaml file. Once we create this file, we can execute the script again. We will see that the previous error is now gone, but now we're getting a new error because we do have a configuration file. It can find it, but the configuration file is not actually configured. So at this point, we are unsuccessfully calling the API, and we will go through configuring that next. Okay, so we are getting to the point where we're about ready to start using the script to interact with the Google Ads API. Before we start doing that, though, I want to talk to you about the Google Ads Doctor. It's a debugging tool that we provide that's open source. It's available on GitHub, and it should be your go-to tool for helping check for and recover from credential issues and OAuth issues when you're configuring client libraries. It's very easy to get the OAuth tool, the Google Ads Doctor. It is just a repo on GitHub that you can clone. Once you clone this, it includes a number of binaries for different operating systems and architectures, which should cover the majority of needs. Once we have that checked out, let's just do a quick run through real quick to make sure that you can actually execute the binary. And when we do this, we can then see what some of the options are for the OAuth Doctor. A couple of them are required. Some of them are helpful but are not always needed. Once we know that the binary, the OAuth Doctor binary, can be executed, let's give it a spin and see how it works. So at this time, instead of doing help as the options, we're going to execute it with some more realistic options. So we're going to set the language to Ruby, since Ruby is the client library that we're using right now. we are using the desktop flow of OAuth, which means we will set the OAuth type to installed app. Installed app is another way of saying desktop flow. And then we're going to say that the configuration file is located in the same directory as in the current working directory. So if we execute this now, we can see, oh yeah, we don't have client ID, we don't have client secret, we don't have developer token. These are all necessary values to interact with the Google Ads API. So we already knew that the configuration file was empty, but this is, if we didn't know that initially, if we were, then the oauthdoctor would be very helpful in identifying that. So we know that the configuration file is empty. We got to put some values in it. Let's do that. So for a Ruby configuration, we already have the setup basic configuration here. You'll note that these three values, the developer token, the client ID, and the client secret, need to be replaced. I have those handily available. The developer token you will need to get from a manager, a Google Ads account. The client ID and client secret will come from a GCP project. And now if we run the Google Ads Doctor tool again, we'll see that now those values are found, which is great because they should be. And you will also note that we are now at a new step with the tool where it's asking for the account ID. This is an ID that you will pull from your Google Ads account that you want to authenticate as. By default, it'll have a couple of dashes in it. You'll want to strip those out and just pass them in without those dashes. Once you have given that Google Ads account ID, oauthdoctor will print out this authorization URL. Within this authorization URL, you'll notice a couple of different parameters on it. Access type offline makes it so that the credential will last for a while without the user having to constantly be active. You can use the credentials in the background when the user is not active in your application. Client ID, we set up as configuration. Redirect URI and response type are set up, are configured in this case for the desktop flow. This makes it so that the Google authentication server will print out a code that the user will have to manually copy and paste back to the application. If you are using the web flow, instead of printing a code, the authorization server will do a redirect back to the web server. In this instance, we don't want the overhead of running a web server, so we're using the desktop flow. And then there's an additional parameter here of scope. This is how you specify what scope of data you want to authorize access for. We are going to do something a little special in this instance, just for this example, because I want to show you what it looks like if you have valid credentials, but the credentials are not authorized for the Google Ads API. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an additional scope of email. Email is a special shorthand scope that stands for getting the email address of the authorizing URL. It's very similar. This is how the like sign in with Google flow works. And adding this email scope is purely because a scope, when authorizing access, there has to be at least one scope that is approved. And since we're going to temporarily ignore the Google Ads API scope, we need to temporarily add a different scope to authorize. So once we've modified this URL, we can take it into the browser. So we'll see that providing the email address has already been selected. We're going to ignore the Manage Your AdWords campaigns for now, temporarily, and we'll hit continue. Once we hit continue, we will see that we will get a code. This code will allow us to complete the authorization flow, and so we'll take this code, copy it back into the oauthdoctor tool, which will take that code and convert it into a valid OAuth refresh token, but those credentials don't have access to the Google Ads API, and so the oauthdoctor tool will actually say, hey, you don't actually have access to the Ads API, so we're, and it'll throw an error. Now that we know that, we can get a valid credentials for a user, but it doesn't have the right access, we can now look at fixing that and making sure that we get the correct scopes authorized for that user. Cool. So now that we know how to go through this flow, we're going to use the doctor to generate an authorization URL an additional time. Taking this URL, putting it into the browser, we'll want to make sure that we select the correct user, and then finally make sure that you do enable the AdWords campaigns or Google Ads campaigns access. Once you have enabled that scope and you hit continue, we'll take the code that Google provides us, pass it back to the Google Ads Doctor tool. It will take that code, again, convert that code into a valid credential for the user. But this time, once it goes to do those additional validation checks to see, hey, do you actually have access to the Google Ads API, we will get a successful result. And now that it knows that the credentials work for interacting with the Google Ads API, it'll offer to save those credentials in the configuration file, which we will go ahead and do. So we now have a refresh token. This refresh token cannot actually be used directly with the Google Ads API. The refresh token are credentials for the user that are long-lasting. They don't expire by themselves, although note that they could become invalid if the user revokes them, for example, or for example, if a user changes their password, then their refresh token may get revoked. But so you won't use the refresh token directly with the API. Instead, what you end up doing is taking the refresh token, using it to generate an access token, and that access token is short-lived, will expire after an hour, and is passed along with each API request to the Google Ads API. And this is one of those reasons where using client libraries is a good idea, because it will automatically handle that token exchange under the cover. And so if your access token expires, it'll make sure that it uses refresh tokens it knows about to make sure it gets an updated one, which is super handy. Awesome. So now that we have some credentials for the user, some valid credentials, we can actually use those in an example and see how what a successful execution looks like. With our main script, you can see that it's currently pretty empty right now. All it's loading is the client library, and it's configuring itself. So let's add some simple example code that we will copy from the get campaigns examples. You can find an equivalent version in every programming language that we have a client library for. Within that example, we will have to say what our customer ID is. And then, because some of you might be using test accounts that don't have anything set up, we're actually going to change the example slightly so that we're not actually querying campaigns, because you may not have any. So we're going to query customers instead, which is a very simple change. We basically just have to change the resource that's getting queried, and then additionally change name to descriptive name. And once that's completed, we can execute it, and we will see the customer details. So the most of the stuff we've been walking through so far has been kind of taking the approach of setting up a new engagement with the API. Sometimes you might have an existing script that's set up, or implementation that's all set up and has been running in the background, and maybe it fails, maybe it stops working at some point in time. one of the things that can sometimes cause from this to happen is like all the different tokens that are used to connect to the API, the developer token, the client secret, the client ID, the refresh token. Like these are all gibberish strings that as a user, as a person, when you look at it, you don't really know if it's valid or not. It has to be actually attempted to be used to really know if it's good. And so once you have these kinds of values in play, a lot of times they're displayed on a website somewhere, and you have to get that into a configuration file or into an environment variable. And it's something that could be very easy for a developer to be copying and pasting and to not highlight the entire string or something similar to that. So it's very easy to get like an invalid refresh token, which will simulate by deleting a character here. You could also get basically the same results by expiring or revoking access to the credentials. Once you've now have an invalid refresh token saved in the configuration, if we go and execute the script, normally that script completes instantaneously. It's very quick. In this case, it's thinking real hard. We can tell now that something's going wrong here, and so if we exit it, we actually see an authorization failed error. So we know that the authentication details are no longer valid. Luckily, it's actually very easy to recover from that using the doctor, the OAuth doctor, because we can essentially follow the same flow, even though we might not necessarily know that the refresh token's invalid. It might, it failed. Maybe the developer token was incorrectly copied or something like that. But if we run the doctor tool, throw in the Google account ID, going through this whole flow again of generating the authorization URL, taking that into the browser, selecting the account, making sure that you enable that scope, authorizing, taking that code, copying it back to the OAuth doctor, makes it very easy to make sure that the code is, that the credentials get updated correctly, because the OAuth doctor makes it very easy to go through that flow and automatically update the configuration file with the value that we expect. Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been an overview of how to use credentials with the Google Ads API and how to use the Google Ads doctor to help you debug some common credential and client library configuration issues you might have. If you are running into issues or having trouble, please don't hesitate to post in the QA forum or reach out to the Google Ads API support. I am Abraham Williams, and thanks for coming. You're awesome.